Welcome to our channel. Before we get started, please consider liking and subscribing so we can bring more stories like this to you. I never expected to spend my retirement battling an HO, let alone starring in a neighborhood saga that felt straight out of a courtroom drama. My name's Anita, and until last year, I had nothing but mild complaints about my neighbors, loud lawnmowers at dawn, the occasional late-night television blasting through thin walls. You know, the typical suburban quirks. I moved into Northwood Fields about 6 years ago after my husband, Thomas, got sick. We needed a smaller home that required less maintenance, and the advertised supportive community for seniors seemed like the perfect place to settle down. When we first arrived, the neighborhood was peaceful, if a bit quiet. The HOA, led by a woman named Geraldine, who everyone secretly called Jerry, sent newsletters reminding residents about trash pickup and the importance of keeping sidewalks clear. Standard stuff. Jerry was a retired school principal. At first blush, she seemed like a concerned neighbor who just wanted to keep everyone informed. But over time, her pleasant exterior gave way to something more controlling. Thomas has a neurodegenerative condition. Over the last year, his mobility and independence declined rapidly. We tried in-home physical therapy, speech therapy, the whole 9 yards, but the toll on him, and on me, was enormous. Eventually, I realized I could no longer handle his care alone. With our children scattered across different states, and each balancing their own hectic lives, I decided it was time to hire a certified home caregiver. That's where Denise came in. Denise was a breath of fresh air. Experienced, patient, and empathic, she brought a warmth into our house that I'd felt missing since Thomas got really sick. Because she visited daily, I thought it was prudent to inform the HO, simply as a courtesy. I naively assumed they'd be grateful I'd let them know, so they wouldn't wonder about a new face entering our gated community. I sent a brief email to Jerry. Hello Jerry. This is Anita from 409 Oakview. Just a heads up, I've hired a caregiver named Denise to help with my husband's medical needs. She'll be at the house most weekdays and sometimes on weekends. Please let me know if there's any documentation you need. Thank you. It took her only an hour to respond. Anita, thank you for informing us. The HOA board will review your request. We'll be in touch. Best. Jerry. Her email took me aback. Request? I didn't realize I was supposed to formally request permission for a caregiver. As far as I knew, the only rule about visitors was related to long-term tenants who intended to stay overnight for more than 30 consecutive days. Denise lived off-site and was simply commuting to care for Thomas. That should have been the end of it. But a few days later, I found a certified letter in my mailbox, on official Northwood Fields letterhead, asking me to provide a detailed schedule of caregiver visits, along with justification for the necessity of such visits. I felt my blood pressure rise. Justification for the necessity of such visits? Thomas's care wasn't some optional whim. It was a matter of life and health. Still, I tried to keep calm. I wrote back, explaining that Thomas's physician had ordered additional home health services and that Denise was simply fulfilling that requirement. I assumed that would satisfy them. Then, a couple of weeks later, I got a notice stating that Denise could only park her car on the street for a maximum of 3 hours and that she would need a temporary visitor's permit from the HOA if she intended to stay longer. That was bizarre. The community's public roads were technically maintained by the city, not the HOA. Moreover, this so-called permit came with a whopping $120 monthly fee. Outrageous! I decided it was time for a face-to-face conversation. Jerry offered to discuss the matter at the next HOA meeting, which was held in the community's small clubhouse. Thinking this would be a straightforward exchange, maybe a bit tedious, but calm, I marched in, prepared to defend my stance. There were about a dozen people present, most of them retirees who typically showed up for free coffee and to hear the monthly updates. Jerry sat at a folding table with 2 other board members, Milton and Sharon, on either side of her. All 3 wore crisp polo shirts embroidered with the Northwood Fields logo. When we got to the new business portion of the meeting, Jerry cleared her throat dramatically. We have a concern regarding a resident who has initiated frequent caregiver visits without properly following the occupancy guidelines. Everyone turned to look at me. My heart thumped in my chest. Thomas has a progressive condition, I began. We need daily medical and personal assistance. I didn't realize there was any conflict with the rules. You've disregarded official processes, Jerry interrupted. The visitor's permit is non-negotiable. We don't allow unregistered employees to come in and out at all hours, especially since it raises liability issues for the HOA. I sat there stunned. But she's a medical professional, and she's here for my husband's health. Do you really need an additional fee for that? Milton chimed in, reciting from a binder of rules. Article 4 states that any non-resident providing regular services, gardening, housekeeping, or otherwise, must either register with the HOA or have the resident pay for a monthly visitor's permit. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were trying to classify a medical caregiver the same way they'd classify a landscaper. I have zero issue with registration, but the monthly fee is practically extortion. And what if Thomas's care requires more time? Do I just keep paying more fees? Jerry flashed a condescending grin. That is the policy as it stands. The rest of the meeting breezed along as if my concerns were just a footnote. I left feeling a surge of anger and frustration, my hands shaking as I clutched the community handbook they'd given me. The worst part was seeing a few of my neighbors avert their eyes rather than offer me any support. People I'd considered friendly acquaintances just sat in silence. Over the next few days, I tried to find an alternative solution. Maybe Denise could park in my driveway, but apparently the HOA had rules about extended stays there, too. If Jerry noticed Denise's car for more than 4 hours, she'd snap a photo and email me a reminder, counting how many times it exceeded the limit. The fines started rolling in. At first, it was $50 here, $75 there. Then it escalated to $150 with a threat of further action. It felt surreal to be punished for helping my sick husband. I decided enough was enough. Jerry and her board were overreaching. It was time to push back. Little did I know just how ferocious the HOA's response would be, or that it would eventually involve the police in a way I never imagined. To stop the barrage of fines, Denise began taking city transit to my house, which was both inconvenient and time-consuming. In her line of work, being on a reliable schedule is critical to a patient's routine, especially someone like Thomas, who needed timely medication, physical therapy, and other support. But even the bus was no perfect solution. The route only ran every 2 hours, and if Denise missed it, she'd be delayed indefinitely. I felt so guilty. Here was a woman trying to help keep my husband alive and comfortable, and our living situation was making her job unbearable. I asked Jerry, one last time, if we could please waive the monthly visitor's permit. She refused, citing a vague precedent and claiming that an exception for me would lead to loopholes for others. No sense of compassion, just bureaucratic nonsense. Meanwhile, Thomas's condition grew worse. Watching him struggle to perform even the simplest tasks without Denise's punctual help was heartbreaking. One day, he stumbled while trying to get to the bathroom. Denise and I managed to catch him before he hit the floor, but he was badly shaken. That same afternoon, I found another fine taped to our front door, $200 for repeated violation of vehicle policy. I'll never forget the moment of absolute despair I felt, clutching that piece of paper while my husband lay on the couch, trembling with exhaustion and frustration. My anger pushed me to consult an attorney. A friend of mine from church recommended a local lawyer, Mr. Wellman, who specialized in homeowners association disputes. Over the phone, he sounded cautious. The language in many HRA documents can be tricky. Often, the board has broad authority, but there may be certain legal protections for medical caregivers. Let me take a look at the bylaws and see what you might be able to do. He offered to arrange a meeting with the HOA board, essentially a negotiation, before escalating to any formal legal steps. I agreed, hoping it might encourage them to be flexible. Perhaps, if confronted by an attorney, they'd realize the potential liability of denying essential medical assistance. We scheduled the meeting for a Wednesday morning in the clubhouse. Mr. Wellman and I arrived at 10 a.m. to find Jerry, Milton, and Sharon already seated behind a rectangular table. Jerry's arms were folded across her chest, mouth set in a grim line. She looked like she'd spent the night preparing an arsenal of bullet points to shoot down any compromise. Mr. Wellman started diplomatically. We understand the importance of community rules. However, my client has a unique medical necessity. The caregiver, Denise, is not a long-term tenant or occupant. We believe these fines and fees to be excessive and in conflict with certain provisions under state law for caregiving exceptions. It didn't take long for Jerry to interrupt with hostility. We have a right, under our covenant, to regulate all non-resident traffic. It's crucial for neighborhood security and liability reasons. Sharon jumped in, and you can't expect all of us to foot the bill if something happens. What if she falls on the property? The HOA could be sued. Mr. Wellman calmly slid a document across the table. Here is the state statute referencing caregivers for the elderly and medically frail. It explicitly states that HOAs cannot impose unreasonable barriers to care. Milton shuffled through some papers. Well, that's not in our bylaws, so it doesn't apply. I felt my face grow hot. That's not how the law works. You can't just ignore state statutes because they aren't mentioned in your precious handbook. Jerry gave me a cold, tight-lipped grin. We'll review it with our counsel. And that was that. The meeting ended with zero resolution. Jerry's last words before marching out were, "The HOA board stands by its decision." Everything shifted the following week. I was in the kitchen making lunch for Thomas when I heard shouting outside. I rushed to the window and saw 2 police cars pulled up in front of our house. My heart nearly stopped as I opened the door, only to find a distressed Denise and 2 officers on our front lawn. Apparently, Jerry had reported a suspicious individual lurking in the neighborhood. She described Denise's older model sedan, one Denise had borrowed that day because her usual car was in the shop, and claimed it had been parked illegally on the street. The call implied potential criminal activity. So the police arrived, expecting they might be dealing with a trespasser or even a thief. Denise, holding her caregiver badge, explained repeatedly that she worked there and that I was the homeowner. I immediately corroborated her story, but Jerry stood off to the side, arms crossed, insisting, "She's not authorized to park there. This is private property." She even tried telling the officers that I was in the wrong, that I hadn't submitted the correct forms for this new vehicle. The lead officer, clearly puzzled, asked Jerry to produce any documentation proving her claim that the street was private or that the car was illegally parked. Jerry didn't have it on hand, so she tried to recite the HOA rules from memory. The officer, politely but firmly, reminded her that city regulations override HOA guidelines regarding public streets. If it's a city street, the HOA can't unilaterally issue fines or call for immediate towing. Realizing she was getting nowhere, Jerry stepped back, scowling, and threatened to pursue other legal avenues. The police left, but not before giving Denise and me an apologetic shrug. They likely had bigger problems to worry about than a petty HOA fight, but it was humiliating nonetheless. Our neighbors peered from their windows and doorways, drawn by the flashing lights and cop cars. I felt a surge of indignation, a cold, twisting anger in my gut. Jerry had crossed a line by calling the authorities on the woman who was taking care of my sick husband. From that day forward, Denise parked wherever was most convenient for Thomas's care. I dared Jerry to call the cops again. If she was going to drag everyone through this ridiculous routine, I might as well force her to do it out in the open. My attorney, in the meantime, decided we had enough grounds for legal action. He prepared a formal complaint against the HOA for harassment and for violating state laws concerning elder care accommodations. Thomas tried to reassure me. "It'll work out," he said quietly one night, gripping my hand. But I could see in his eyes how weary he was. All this commotion weighed on him, chipped away at his sense of peace, which was the last thing a man in his condition needed. I told him I'd do whatever it took to stand up for him, and for every other resident who might eventually face something similar. As the weeks dragged on, the tension in the neighborhood reached a boiling point. Jerry distributed flyers claiming that outsiders were taking advantage of loopholes. One morning, I saw her personally stuffing them into mailboxes. While I was reluctant to stoop to her level, I felt compelled to refute her scare tactics. But how? Just when I thought things had reached the peak of absurdity, Jerry made one more drastic move that pushed us all over the edge, straight into court. I woke up one Saturday to loud knocks at the door. Outside stood a process server, a young man in a rumpled dress shirt, handing me an official packet. The HOA had filed a lawsuit against me for breach of contract. In the complaint, they claimed I had repeatedly violated parking regulations, visitor policies, and nuisance guidelines. The language was over the top, painting Denise as a perpetual disturbance who was allegedly causing the neighborhood undue stress. More than that, they alleged I was in default of my HOA obligations, subject to thousands of dollars in fines and legal fees. I nearly laughed at the audacity. They were the ones pushing me around, levying insane fines, and calling the cops under false pretenses. And now they wanted to paint me as the bad guy? Fine, I thought, if they want to go the legal route, I'm ready. Mr. Wellman reassured me. These suits can drag on, but we have a strong defense. Plus, there's the statute protecting caregiving services. Let's countersue for harassment, attorney's fees, and emotional distress if they want to make this official. Despite my anxiety, I felt a certain relief that everything was finally out in the open. If they wanted a fight, we'd meet them head-on. The day of the hearing arrived a month later. We trudged into a modest county courthouse with its beige walls and creaky benches. Jerry and Milton were sitting in the hallway, whispering to each other, while Sharon fidgeted with a stack of papers. They glared at me, but I resisted the urge to glare back. I focused on Thomas, who insisted on accompanying me even though it was tough for him physically. He wanted to be present. His quiet show of support gave me strength. In the courtroom, the HOA's lawyer presented the board's case, flipping through slides of alleged violations, mostly timestamps of Denise's car parked illegally or claims that she impeded walkways. They tried to argue that Denise's presence detracted from the character of the community, referencing the covenant's broad language about maintaining a peaceful environment. It all sounded so desperate. Mr. Wellman countered skillfully. He pointed out that the HOA's own bylaws had no explicit terms for prohibiting the parking of a caregiver's vehicle in the driveway. They had only a general statement about visitor registration, designed for long-term boarders or subletters. Furthermore, the state law was quite clear that HOAs cannot unreasonably interfere with or charge excessive fees for medically necessary caregiving. He also highlighted the repeated fines, the harassing flyers, and the baseless police call, all showing a pattern of targeted intimidation. A turning point came when Thomas, slowly but determinedly, approached the stand. He spoke in a halting voice, but with unmistakable sincerity. My wife and I moved here for peace. The only reason we're here in court is because I'm sick, and she's fighting for my right to receive help. No community should make you feel guilty or unwelcome for needing care. There were hushed murmurs in the courtroom. I saw Sharon shift uncomfortably in her seat. Even Milton looked down at his hands, avoiding eye contact. When the judge asked Jerry why the board insisted on such harsh measures against a resident with serious medical issues, her response was chillingly self-righteous. If we allow one person to bend the rules, soon everyone will have new excuses, relatives, caregivers, maintenance workers, turning the neighborhood into a circus. We're preserving property values and community integrity. She sounded more like a stubborn politician than a concerned neighbor. The judge paused before speaking, as if carefully choosing his words. I find the HOA's actions here excessively punitive and not supported by reasonable interpretations of their own bylaws or state law. Charging repeated fines for what amounts to necessary caregiving is unconscionable. The police incident, moreover, was a gross misuse of emergency services. Jerry went pale. In his final ruling, the judge dismissed the HOA's lawsuit against me, declared many of the so-called fines invalid, and rebuked the board for overstepping its authority. He even ordered them to reimburse my legal fees. Jerry looked stunned, as though she'd just watched her meticulously crafted house of cards collapse in real time. I almost expected her to argue back, but she and the other board members just stared at their papers, speechless. Outside the courthouse, I felt a rush of relief. Thomas gripped my hand, tears welling in his eyes. Mr. Wellman smiled, reminding me, justice might be slow, but it's still justice. Denise came over and gave us both a hug, beaming with gratitude. It felt like a victory not just for us, but for anyone who'd ever been bullied by a petty HOA tyrant. Back at Northwood Fields, word spread quickly about the judge's ruling. Some neighbors congratulated me discreetly, relieved that Jerry's iron-fisted approach had finally been tempered. Others, particularly those loyal to Jerry, remained icy, scurrying off whenever I passed them in the street. The board quietly paid me the reimbursement, though they never offered an apology. Jerry resigned as president a few weeks later, citing health reasons. Milton took over in the interim, and Sharon became strangely reclusive. I heard rumors she intended to move out of the neighborhood altogether. Since then, the atmosphere around Northwood Fields has changed, at least a little. They're revising the bylaws to explicitly address caregiver parking and essential medical visits. There's even talk of scheduling a monthly coffee gathering to encourage open discussion, so no one else endures the secrecy and intimidation I faced. Thomas's health, unfortunately, continues its slow decline, but at least he's getting the consistent, quality care he needs in the comfort of his home. And while the memory of that tense conflict still sets my nerves on edge, I'm grateful we stood our ground. We proved that not even the most overbearing HOA can stand in the way of basic compassion and common sense. Older or younger, healthy or ill, everyone deserves the right to live peacefully without harassment. And so ends the saga. If you ever find yourself facing an HOA that's grown too big for its britches, remember our story. Sometimes, you have to weather the storm of intimidation and bureaucracy. But with the right support, the law, and simple human decency can still prevail.